Callum Voss never expected that walking into a highway diner outside Sudbury on a Wednesday night would be the last mistake he ever made with his pride intact. He came in with 3 men, all of them wearing the kind of expensive quiet that screams money louder than anything flashy ever could. Dark coats, clean hands, the practiced stillness of people who had learned a long time ago that the room should go silent when they entered. Not because they demanded it, but because it simply happened. Callum himself was 41, lean in the way that only discipline and occasional violence produce. With grey threading through dark hair at his temples and eyes, the flat colour of a winter lake, he ran the Voss syndicate out of Montreal, which meant he effectively ran the supply lines for half of eastern Canada. Stolen cargo, pharmaceutical diversions, protection networks that stretched from Windsor to Halifax, the kind of infrastructure that governments quietly acknowledged existed and quietly declined to dismantle, because the alternative was worse. He had come to Sudbury to close a deal with a northern distributor. He had stopped at the diner because it was 2 a.m, and even men like Callum Voss needed coffee. What he did not expect was Petra. Petra Gough was 26 years old and had been working the overnight shift at the Crossroads diner for the past 8 months, ever since the cleaning company she'd worked for had folded and left her 3 weeks of wages short. She was a big woman, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of heavy, solid frame that came from a lifetime of physical work and eating whatever was actually affordable rather than what magazines suggested. She wore her dark hair pinned back tight, a grease-spotted apron tied around her thick waist, and she moved through the narrow gap between the counter and the kitchen pass-through with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had made peace with her body a long time ago. She wasn't performing comfort. She simply occupied space the way a load-bearing wall occupies space, functionally, completely, without apology. The diner had 4 other customers when Callum and his men came in. A trucker at the far end of the counter, 2 college kids sharing a plate of fries, an older woman doing a crossword. None of them looked up when the bell above the door chimed. Petra did. She clocked them in about 2 seconds flat. The posture, the coats, the way the one with the broken capillaries across his nose positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of the tallest man. Bodyguard instinct, automatic. The tallest man was the one in charge. She had grown up in Sault Ste. Marie, the daughter of a woman who cleaned hotel rooms for a man who owed considerable debts to people Petra now recognized on sight. She picked up 4 menus anyway. Professionals ate 2. She put them in the booth near the window without being asked. Callum's eyes followed her as she walked back to the counter. "Coffee?" she said, not really a question. "Black," Callum said. "All 4. She poured without ceremony. One of the men, a thick-necked younger one who had the specific look of someone who had recently been promoted past his emotional maturity, watched her fill the cups with an expression she recognized immediately. The slow, deliberate inventory, the pause at her waist, the faint curl of the lip that wasn't quite a smile. "Generous portions," he said, mostly to the man beside him. Quiet enough to be deniable, loud enough to be heard. Petra set the coffee pot down. She looked at him directly. "You want something to eat, or are you just burning calories running your mouth?" Dead silence. The trucker at the counter went very still. The college kid stopped chewing. Even the older woman with the crossword looked up. The thick-necked one, she would later learn his name was Bryce, started to push back from the table. Callum's hand landed on his forearm before he got anywhere. A single flat pressure. "Don't." Bryce subsided, but his eyes were hot and ugly. "We'll have the specials," Callum said, his voice carrying no particular heat. He was looking at Petra with an expression she couldn't entirely read, not anger, not amusement, something more attentive than either. She wrote it down and went back to the kitchen. The cook, a man named Geordie who had worked the overnight at the Crossroads for 11 years, looked at her face when she came through the swinging door. "Everything good out there?" "Fine," Petra said. She ripped the order slip and clicked it to the wheel. 4 specials. She was not fine exactly. Her hands were completely steady, which was the point. She had learned a very long time ago that hands were the one part of you that couldn't lie if you let them shake. So she didn't let them shake. Her mother had taught her that. Her mother, who had cleaned up after men like Callum Voss for 20 years and never once let a hand shake in front of them, even when the rest of her was coming apart. Petra brought the food out herself. 4 plates, 2 in each hand, balanced with the casual competence of someone who had carried much heavier things. She set them down without spilling anything. Bryce looked up at her. "I hope you didn't sit on mine." She pulled out her order pad. She wrote something on it, tore the page off, and set it face down on the table in front of him. "What's this?" he said. "Number for a good therapist," Petra said pleasantly, "since whatever's happening in your head clearly needs professional attention." One of the other men, older, with the careful eyes of someone who had survived by reading rooms accurately, made a sound that was almost a laugh and cut it off immediately. Callum said nothing. He was watching her again with that same unreadable attention. She went back to the counter. The 4 of them ate in relative quiet for a while. Petra refilled the trucker's coffee, ran the card for the college kids, chatted briefly with the crossword woman about a 7-letter word for systemic deception. "Conspiracy," she said without looking it up. The woman confirmed it and looked impressed. It was nearly 2:30 when Callum came to the counter. His men were still in the booth. He sat down on a stool, which felt odd. A man like that choosing the counter. He set both hands flat on the laminate surface, a gesture she recognized as deliberate. No threat. "Look, nothing hidden. I want to apologize for Bryce," he said. "I don't need it." "I know. I'm offering it anyway." He paused. What he said was disrespectful. Petra looked at him steadily. He said what he thought in a room where he figured it wouldn't matter. That's not a him problem, that's a culture problem. Your culture. She poured herself a coffee, which she almost never did on shift, and leaned against the back counter, so the apology is maybe pointed in the wrong direction. Something shifted in Callum's expression, not offense, more like recalibration. "You know who I am," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have a reasonable guess. And you're still talking to me like this." "I'm talking to you like this because you sat down at my counter at 2:30 in the morning, and the other options are stand here in silence or go out back and have a small crisis, and I'm too tired for the second one." She sipped the coffee. It was bad. She'd made it 6 hours ago. She drank it anyway. "What do you actually want?" Callum was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on its saucer. "There's a man," he said carefully, "who has been taking money from a number of small businesses in this part of the highway corridor. Gas stations, diners, motels, a kind of informal tax that he's been collecting for the past 18 months, under the impression that the territory is unaffiliated. And it's not." Callum looked at her. "My organization has a long-standing arrangement with several of those business owners. The arrangement predates this man's operation by about 8 years. He is either unaware of it or he's aware and he doesn't care, which is a more significant problem." Petra was quiet, thinking, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because this diner is on the list." He said it simply, without drama. "Someone has been collecting from the owner here. I'm assuming without the owner's enthusiastic agreement, given that the crossroad has been operating on the kind of margins that don't leave a lot of room for informal taxes." Petra thought about the phone call she'd overheard 2 months ago. Geordie's muffled voice in the office, the tightness around his eyes the next morning. The way the hours had been cut back slowly and then partially restored, like someone breathing around a bruise. She had not asked. She had not been asked. "What do you want from me?" she said. "I want to know if you've noticed anyone coming in on the schedule, collecting, who they talk to, when." He studied her face. "You're here 5 nights a week. You watch people. You clearly process information quickly. And you don't panic. I also don't work for you." "No," he agreed. "You don't." He paused. "I'm asking you to consider it." Petra looked at him for a long moment. The trucker had gone. The diner was quiet. Geordie was doing the last of the prep in the kitchen. The radio turned low to a country station. The fluorescent light above the second booth had been flickering for 3 weeks, and nobody had fixed it yet. What does consideration look like? She said. A conversation. Tomorrow. Somewhere that isn't here. He reached into his coat and put a card on the counter. Plain white single phone number, no name. You call if you want to have it. You don't call and we both go on with our evenings. And this conversation didn't happen. She looked at the card. She didn't pick it up yet. The man who's been collecting, she said slowly. Is his name Terence by any chance? About 50, drives a white F-150 with a cracked passenger mirror. Callum was very still. You know him. He comes in every other Thursday, orders the mushroom soup, and tips 4%. She finally picked up the card. He's been talking to Geordie in the office for about 10 minutes each time. Geordie comes out looking like he swallowed something. I've counted 6 visits. She looked at Callum. His passenger always waits in the truck. Young kid, nervous, plays on his phone the whole time. Last Thursday he came in to use the washroom and I saw a tattoo on his forearm. Red diamond, black line through the center. Something crossed Callum's face that she couldn't name. She would think about it later. A kind of sharpening and attention so focused it was almost physical. You know what that mark means, he said. I know it's not loco ink. She had grown up around ink. She knew the difference between neighborhood and organizational. I know it's not from around here. No, Callum said quietly. It's not. He stood up from the stool. His 3 men were watching from the booth, very still, reading their boss's body language the way people in that profession learn to. The conversation tomorrow just became considerably more important. He left $100 under his coffee cup. For 4 coffees and 4 specials, it was more than 4 times what the bill would have been. She didn't call it out. She put it in the till and wrote the correct amount on the receipt and put the remainder in the staff tips envelope, split equally with Geordie. She called the number the following afternoon. The conversation happened in a coffee shop in New Sudbury, all the way across town in a booth near the back. Callum came alone. That surprised her. She said so. I don't need an audience to have a conversation, he said. Most men in your position do. Most men in my position are compensating for something. He folded his hands on the table. He looked, she thought, slightly different in daylight. More tired. More human. The flatness in his eyes was still there. But it was sitting on top of something else, something that had been there long enough to become familiar. Tell me about the tattoo. She told him what she remembered. Every detail, the placement on the inner forearm, the exact proportions of the diamond, the thickness of the line. She had a good visual memory, had always had one, useful in service work, keeping track of who ordered what without writing it down, recognizing regulars from 2 visits. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, the mark belongs to a group operating out of Thunder Bay. They've been pushing east for about 2 years. Terence Boyle is their point man for the corridor between here and North Bay. He's been representing himself as independent, which is either extremely stupid or a deliberate provocation. Why would it be a provocation? Because the man giving him orders knows my name. We have a history. He said it without elaboration, the way people say things they've already decided not to explain further. Petra wrapped both hands around her coffee. So what happens now? Now I have a specific problem instead of a general one. He looked at her. That's significantly easier to resolve. And the diner? Geordie. Geordie will not be contacted again. She studied his face. She had spent a lot of her life studying faces, reading the space between what people said and what they meant. A skill that paid better than any wage she'd ever collected. Callum Voss was a controlled man. Everything about him was measured and contained, but the containment wasn't empty. There was something behind it that she thought might be underneath everything, exhaustion. Not physical. The other kind. Can I ask you something personal? She said. He looked like the question surprised him slightly. You can ask. Do you actually like any of it? A pause, long enough to mean something. Not anymore, he said, not for a while. She didn't press it. They sat for a moment in a silence that was, she noticed, not uncomfortable, which was itself unusual. Over the following 2 weeks, Petra continued her shifts at the crossroads. She texted the number on the card 4 times, twice with details about Terrence's visits, once with a description of a second man she didn't recognize who came in asking for Geordie by name, once with a license plate she'd memorized from the F-150 by habit on a slow Tuesday. She didn't think of herself as working for Callum Voss. She thought of herself as paying attention, which she would have done anyway. Callum texted back briefly each time. Acknowledged, useful, thank you, no instructions. No demands. The restraint of it was notable. She had dealt with enough people in her life who treated any scrap of cooperation as the establishment of ownership to recognize what its absence meant. On the Thursday of the second week, Terrence came in as usual. Mushroom soup. 4% tip. He went to the office and knocked on the doorframe, not quite entering, and Geordie went in with him and pulled the door closed. Petra was behind the counter, wiping it down. The young man with the forearm tattoo came in and took a stool at the counter. He looked younger up close than she'd initially thought, 22 at most, with the kind of carefully neutral expression that kids cultivated when they were trying to look harder than they felt. "What can I get you?" Petra said. "Just a Coke." She poured it. She set it in front of him. He was looking at his phone, but not really looking at it, the way people looked at their phones when they were actually listening to the room. "You've been in before," she said conversationally. "Once or twice. You wait in the truck usually." He looked up at her. Something moved through his expression, not quite alarm. "Good memory." "It's the job." She wiped the counter further down and came back. "You from Thunder Bay originally?" "Very still now. Why do you ask?" "Just making conversation." She smiled at him the way she smiled at all the young ones, slightly older sister, slightly amused. "You've got the accent slightly. My cousin's from up there." He relaxed a fraction. The body always tells you before the face does. "Born there, yeah? Been moving around." "Long way from home," she said pleasantly, and went to check on the table by the window. The office door opened 12 minutes later. Terrence came out looking satisfied, Geordie behind him looking like he'd aged 3 years. Terrence stopped at the counter, dropped a 20 for the soup, and tilted his head at the young man. "Let's go, Curtis." They left. Geordie stood behind the counter for a moment, one hand on the back of his neck. Petra set a coffee in front of him without asking. "You don't have to keep paying him," she said quietly. Geordie looked at her, startled. "Petra, I know. I've known for a while. I'm just telling you." She kept her voice level. "There are people who are aware of what he's been doing. I can't promise you a timeline, but I can tell you that Terrence Boyle is a problem that is currently being resolved by people who have a significant interest in resolving it." She met Geordie's eyes. "Don't pay him next time." Geordie looked at her for a long moment. He was a careful man, not a stupid one. He read the specificity in what she'd said and understood what it meant, or at least understood enough. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay." That night, walking to her car in the parking lot at 3:15 in the morning, Petra noticed the black SUV parked at the far end of the lot, idling. She recognized the make. She stopped. The passenger window came down. Callum Voss was in the back seat. He looked at her through the open window and said nothing for a moment. "Curtis," he said finally. "The boy's name is Curtis Yee. He's 19. His older brother Jonah has been running errands for the Thunder Bay operation since Curtis was 16. A pause. He didn't know what he was walking into. Petra stood with her coat pulled shut against the October cold. The parking lot lights made everything amber and sharp. What happens to him? He goes home. Callum said it like it was already decided. He gets a phone call from someone explaining very clearly that the Thunder Bay operation has concluded its interests in the corridor and that Curtis specifically is to have no further involvement in anything east of the lakehead. It will be a persuasive phone call. And Terrence? A silence that answered the question without words. Petra breathed out. She could see her breath in the cold air. "And Geordie?" "Will not be contacted again, by anyone." He paused. "I already made the arrangement with the previous owner of this corridor. The diner is covered. It always should have been." She looked at him. He was watching her with that same, careful, complete attention she'd first noticed from across the diner 2 weeks ago. In the amber light from the lot, he looked older than he had inside, and also, somehow, more honest. Like the performance had worn thin. "Why are you telling me all this?" Petra said. "In a parking lot at 3 in the morning. You could have sent a text." "I could have," he agreed. "So?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the professional flatness. "You asked me something in that coffee shop, whether I actually liked any of it. You said no." "I did." He turned to the coffee cup in his hand. He was holding one, she realized, a paper cup from somewhere. "I'd been doing this for 20 years. I inherited the structure from my father, who inherited parts of it from his. It's a very efficient machine, and I run it very well, and I have not wanted to be inside it for approximately a decade." He looked up at her. "The last time someone asked me a personal question I wasn't prepared for, and I answered it honestly. I think I was about 32. And what happened then? I stopped answering honestly, a pause, until apparently now. The parking lot was completely silent except for the low idle of the engine. Somewhere on the highway behind the tree line, a transport truck passed, its lights briefly visible through the dark spruce, gone in seconds. Petra looked at this man, 41, grey at the temples, sitting in the back of an expensive car in the parking lot of a highway diner at 3 in the morning, holding a paper coffee cup and saying something true, which she could tell because people who said true things had a particular texture to their voice, a slight roughness where the polish wore off. "I'm not going to sleep with you," she said. "Just so we're clear." Something crossed his face that was unmistakably a real laugh, quickly controlled. I wasn't. "I know you weren't. I'm telling you anyway because I've had a long night and I like to establish parameters." She pulled her keys from her coat pocket. "But if you want to have an honest conversation with a person who will tell you when you're wrong and doesn't want anything from you, I'm around most evenings until 11. He looked at her. The expression on his face was something she didn't have a name for immediately. She would think about it later, driving home on the dark highway, and she would decide it was the expression of a person who had been handed something they didn't know they were missing, and were trying to work out how to hold it carefully. "I'll come in for coffee," he said. "I'll warn you," she said. "It's bad. I made it at 9 and it's been sitting. I'll drink it anyway." She walked to her car. She didn't look back, but she heard the SUV window go up, and then the quiet sound of it pulling out of the lot and heading back onto the highway, taillights disappearing into the dark. He came in the following Tuesday. He sat at the counter. He ordered the coffee, and he drank it without complaint, which she respected, because it really was quite bad by that point in the night. He didn't bring anyone with him. They talked for an hour about nothing and everything. About Sudbury, about growing up in Sault Ste. Marie, about the specific anxiety of a life built on obligations you didn't choose, about what a person does when the machine they run so smoothly that stopping it would hurt everyone inside it except possibly yourself. He came in again the following Friday. And the one after that. Bryce did not come in again. Petra never asked what had happened to reassign him, and Callum never offered, and they both understood the silence to be a reasonable one. What they were exactly, neither of them named for a long time. It resisted naming. He was a criminal, and she was a waitress, and the gap between those two positions was wide enough to drive a transport through, and neither of them was naive about it. But he came through the door 3 nights a week and sat at her counter, and he talked to her like she was a person worth talking to, which she was, obviously, but which had been noted less frequently than it should have been by people with considerably more conventional lives. On a Thursday in early December, a man came in that Petra didn't recognize. He sat in the corner booth and ordered water and spent 45 minutes looking at his phone and occasionally at the counter. He was not looking at the menu. He was not looking at the other customers. He was looking at Petra. She had been looked at in a professional capacity before. She knew the difference between a regular look and a surveillance look, the same way she knew the difference between a customer who was dissatisfied and a customer who was about to cause a problem. This was a surveillance look. Patient, methodical, taking inventory. She texted the number at 11:15. "Someone in the corner booth has been watching me for 45 min, not eating." Checked his watch twice. Dark green jacket. brown hair, early 30s. The reply came in 4 minutes. Leave through the kitchen. Geordie knows the back way. Go now. I'll explain when you're out. She went through the kitchen. She told Geordie she was stepping out, which Geordie accepted without question because Geordie had learned not to ask certain questions. She went through the service door into the loading area and walked to the far end of the parking lot and stood in the cold. Callum called her rather than texting. There's a man, he said, within the Thunder Bay group who believes you have information that would damage his position specifically. He's not wrong. The details you provided about the tattooed mark on Curtis Yee helped me identify a connection I wasn't supposed to know about. He paused. He's looking for leverage. What kind of leverage? The kind that involves following someone home. Petra stood in the cold behind the diner and looked at the dark tree line and let herself feel the fear properly for exactly 10 seconds, the way her mother had taught her. Because fear is information and ignoring it is how you make bad decisions. Then she breathed it out. Okay, she said, tell me what you know about him. A pause. Petra. Tell me what you know about him. Her voice was level. You said he believes I have information, so I have a position. The question is how to use it. She thought for a moment. Does he have family in the area? A brother. Runs a dry cleaning business in. Write this down. Callum was quiet. Ben, go ahead. She laid it out methodically. The way she laid out every section before service, every prep task before a long shift. Systematically, without drama, in order of importance. She'd been paying attention to the people who came through the crossroads for 8 months. She had a very good memory. She remembered which regulars mentioned where they worked, where they lived, what they owned. She knew which delivery drivers covered which routes. She knew which motel on the highway had a camera that faced the road and which ones had been broken since spring. She had not known until this exact moment why she'd been retaining all of it. Her mother had told her once that some people are born with the right instincts and the wrong circumstances, and they spend their whole lives watching opportunities pass by, because nobody ever tells them that watching is itself a skill. Callum listened to everything she said without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You've been compiling this for months, he said. I pay attention, it's not intentional. I believe you, he said. That's what makes it remarkable. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, the professional flatness was completely gone. He sounded, she thought, like a man who had been walking through a dark house for a very long time and had just found a light switch. Are you safe right now? I'm behind the building. He's still inside. I'm 20 minutes out. Don't go back in. Stay on the phone with me. She stayed on the phone. He talked to her about nothing. About the coffee. About whether the diner had ever considered staying open later. About a radio station he'd found on the drive north that played exclusively songs from the 90s that everyone had forgotten on purpose. She could hear, underneath the deliberate calm of his voice, the specific tension of someone driving faster than they were admitting to. He pulled into the back lot 17 minutes later. She got into the front seat, which surprised him. She saw it in his expression, the slight recalibration, because people in his world did not generally choose the front seat. Tell me the problems contained, she said. The man in the green jacket has been asked to leave the property, firmly. He looked at her, in the dark of the car with the parking lot lights coming through the windshield. He looked at her the way she had started to notice. He looked at her lately, like she was the still point in a room that kept moving. The larger issue with the Thunder Bay group will be resolved by Friday, completely. And I don't need to give you anything else. You've given me more than I had any right to ask for. He said it carefully, like it mattered to get the words right. I should have had proper arrangements in place for this corridor years ago. I didn't. People paid for that. She looked at him. That's close to an apology. It's the closest I get. It's enough, she said. The parking lot was very quiet. Somewhere inside the diner, she could hear Geordie running the closing checklist. The faint rattle of the industrial dishwasher through the service wall. I need to go back in and finish my shift, she said. I know. Neither of them moved immediately. Callum, she said. "The thing you said. About not wanting to be inside the machine for a decade." "Yes. What would it take?" "To step away from parts of it. The parts that aren't." She paused, choosing the word carefully. The parts that aren't necessary. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, someone worth stepping away for. He said it simply, without performance. Just a fact, stated plainly, the way people state facts they've been sitting with long enough that the weight has settled. Petra looked straight ahead through the windshield. The highway was a faint light through the trees. "That's a significant thing to say to a woman at 3 in the morning in a parking lot," she said. "I know." "I'm going to go back in now," she said, "and you're going to drive back to wherever you're driving to, and we're going to think about this conversation separately and not make any decisions in a parking lot." "That's reasonable," he said. She got out of the car. She walked back across the lot toward the service door. At the door, she paused, looked back. He was still there, idling, watching her through the windshield. She raised a hand once, a small, uncomplicated gesture. He raised his in return. She went back inside. Geordie looked up from the dishwasher when she came through. He read her face the way people who've worked alongside someone long enough learn to read faces, and he clearly decided not to ask any questions. "Slow close tonight," he said. "You can head out early if you want." "I'll finish it," Petra said. She tied her apron back on. "I always finish what I start." She filled the last of the salt shakers. She wiped down the counter. She turned the sign from open to closed and stood for a moment in the quiet of the empty diner, the fluorescent light above the second booth still flickering. 3 weeks now, and still nobody had fixed it. She made a mental note to get a replacement bulb in the morning. It was, she decided, something she could do herself. Outside, on the highway, Callum Voss drove south through the dark Ontario night. The radio tuned to nothing in particular, his hands steady on the wheel, thinking about a woman who noticed everything and panicked at nothing and had sat in the front seat without being asked, and wondering, for the first time in a considerable number of years, whether the machine he ran was actually as indispensable as he had always believed, or whether that was simply what the machine wanted him to think. "I keep thinking about the moment Petra picked up the card. Not the dramatic stuff. Not the knife. Not the parking lot. Not the man with the green jacket watching her from the corner booth. Just that small, quiet moment where she looked at a plain white card with a single phone number and made a decision that most people would have run from. She didn't pick it up because she was brave in some grand, cinematic way. She picked it up because she'd spent 26 years paying attention when nobody thought it mattered, and she understood, maybe instinctively, that attention is its own kind of power. There's something I find genuinely hard to sit with when I think about stories like Petra's. How many people move through their lives carrying real knowledge, real capability, real steadiness, and get dismissed before they ever get the chance to show any of it? Bryce walked into that diner and looked at her and made a calculation in about 3 seconds. Heavy, unimportant, easy to disrespect. And he was wrong on every count, but nobody had ever corrected him before, so he had no reason to question it. What strikes me is that Petra didn't need the world to validate her to keep being who she was. She already knew. She remembered license plates out of habit. She catalogued tattoos and schedules, and the specific way a person's posture changes when they're afraid. She did all of that quietly, consistently, for 8 months in a highway diner outside Sudbury. And she did it because that's just who she is. Not because anyone was watching. Not because she expected it to matter. That's the thing about integrity, the real kind. It doesn't perform. Geordie noticed it. Callum noticed it. Even Curtis, 19 years old and trying to look harder than he felt, noticed something in the way she talked to him that was different from how most people talk to someone in his position. And Callum, I think about him differently than I expected to. He's not a good man, and the story doesn't pretend he is. But there's something true in what happened between them, something that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with what happens when a person who has been running on autopilot for a decade suddenly meets someone who asks them an honest question and waits for an honest answer. He said nobody had asked him something personal and gotten a real response since he was 32. That's 9 years of saying only what the machine required. The consequences in this story fall the way consequences actually tend to fall, not as punishment, but as weight. Terence collected what wasn't his and eventually stood on ground that couldn't hold him. Bryce treated people as props and found himself quietly reassigned, and Petra, who had done nothing except show up consistently and pay attention and refuse to disappear, found herself holding information that mattered at exactly the moment it needed to matter. I don't think that's coincidence. I think that's just what happens over time when a person keeps their eyes open and their hands steady and their word good. The world is not fair, and I won't pretend it is. But it is, at least sometimes, accurate. It tends, eventually, to find the people who are always worth finding. She went back in and finished her shift. She filled the salt shakers. She made a note about the broken light. That part, honestly, is my favorite part of the whole thing.